So why am I doing this course? Well, one of the reasons is this. I was in a 12-step fellowship meeting, non-sex related, for substances. There were a bunch of old timers. It was a men's meeting. And one of the first guys to share was talking about difficulties that he was having with pornography. And that became the theme of the meeting. All of the guys, there were 12, 13 of them, each one of them was like, yeah, everybody, that even guys that I had known that are really lively and joyous, took on this kind of sullen, dark, depressive, I too suffer from that, or I too struggle with pornography, or I wish I could stop. And I was like, holy smokes. I think it was 12 of the 14 guys in the meeting, some of them with long-term sobriety, were really struggling with sex stuff, pornography stuff, compulsive stuff that was bringing them an inordinate amount of shame. And I started to think, oh my goodness, could this possibly jeopardize their sobriety, or at the very least, make life miserable? Maybe it could be preventing them from experiencing happy, joyous, and free. And I was like, maybe I need to get the message out there to these guys, because I have experienced chemical sobriety for years without the sex stuff. So I know that I was missing out on something that I had no clue that I was missing out on. And my inner geek said, I think I'm going to test this out. How many of these people could actually be truly suffering? And are they really at risk of a relapse? So I put out a survey, and basically it was 13 question or 12 question sexual inventory. I did a control group of people who were not addicts, and then I did people who did identify as addicts in recovery. I saw how they compared on this test, and I'd like to share the results with you so we can see, okay, are people in recovery actually more susceptible to sex addiction? If so, are they actually suffering with it? Let's take a look. So we wanted to see if we could understand the coincidence and the role that sex addiction might play in the maintenance of sobriety. In doing so, we discovered a few things. So for non-addicts, there were a large percentage of non-addict men who are struggling with sex, intimacy, and most importantly, compulsive and addictive sexual behavior. 2, the same can be said for non-addict women. However, the components or causes between non-addict men and women seem to be different. So let's talk about addicts on the whole. In recovery, a huge percentage of addicts in recovery would most likely meet criteria for sex addiction. That's 91% of men and 82% of women. Nearly half of all recovering men qualify for sex addiction with flying colors, answering yes to 7 or more questions on the screening test. These are some differences between non-addict men and men in recovery. Shame about sexuality is significantly higher for men in recovery, but a big contributor to sex addiction in both. The same can be said for secrecy. However, it is interesting to note that it's less of a contributor for men in recovery than non-addict men. Requiring an increase in intensity and frequency is another huge contributor to sexual compulsion in men both in and out of recovery. And as you can see, there's little difference between the two groups. Nearly a third of both groups of men experience relationships distorted by sexual preoccupation and repeating the same destructive patterns over and over. Men in recovery are 3 times more likely to report that their sexual activities involve coercion, violence, or threat of violence. A third of non-addict men and 40% of men in recovery would say that their preoccupation with sex causes them difficulties in some areas of their life, even when they do not act upon them. 24% of non-addict and 40% of recovering men would say that pornography occupies a large amount of their time and jeopardizes their relationships or employment. 24% of normal and 38% of recovered men would say that the pursuit of sex or relationships has left them feeling hopeless, alienated from others, or suicidal. 35% of non-addict men and 40% of men in recovery report that they've considered getting outside professional help for sex issues in general. A third of normal and half of recovering men state that desires have driven them to sex in places or with people that they would not normally choose. 15% of normal men or non-addict men and 10% of recovered men report that their sexual practice caused or could cause them legal problems. Surprisingly, it seems that recovered men do better in this area of impulse control. Here are some differences between non-addict women and women in recovery. Non-addict women do not report to experience shame, guilt, or remorse after sex, while women in recovery very, very often do. They do so just as often as men in recovery and non-addict men as well. 37% of non-addict women and 75% of recovered women report that they keep secrets about their sexual behavior or fantasy life from those people that are important to them. Probably the most stark contrast between non-addict women and women in recovery is that only 10% of non-addict women report that their relationships have become distorted with sexual preoccupation or repeat the same destructive patterns, while women in recovery are 4 times as likely to report this. 10% of non-addict and 12% of recovery women report that their sexual activities involve coercion, violence, or threat of disease. 10% of non-addict and 23% of recovering women would say that their preoccupation with sex causes them difficulties in some area of their life, even when they do not act on them. In both non-addict and women in recovery, use of pornography doesn't seem to be an issue. 10% of non-addict and 55% of recovered women would say that pursuit of sex or relationship has left them feeling hopeless, alienated from others, or suicidal. That's a 5.5-fold increase, nearly 6 times. So pursuit of sex and relationships leaves them feeling hopeless, alienated, or suicidal. 55%. 2% of non-addict and 60% of recovered women report that they have sought out help for sexual issues. 20% of non-addict and half of recovering women state that desires have driven them to sex in places or with people that they would not normally choose. None of the non-addict and only 3% of recovered women report that their sexual practices have caused or could cause them legal problems. So here are some of the main takeaways that I get from all of this data. 1, both men and women in recovery are at significant risk of relapse due to sexual compulsivity. Also, the quality of life in their recovery would be dramatically improved if they were to address these issues. Also, the U.S. male population is being pummeled by shame and sexual addiction. It's become the public health crisis that nobody wants to talk about. Men are not addressing their sexual addiction or their shame about sex. Compulsive use of pornography is the norm. With men in recovery, addictive sex was likely used to address toxic shame that was already present. They were using sex or pornography to medicate toxic shame. Whereas with non-addict men, falling into sexual compulsion has become the source of toxic shame. In both cases, these men are stuck in a shame cycle of addiction and need to treat the behavior and the thinking involved. The main difference that I see between non-addict women and those in recovery is that the average non-addict woman does not view their sexual behavior as shameful and generally doesn't get into patterns of relationships which they feel are unhealthy. Most women in recovery struggle tremendously with these issues. The fact that there's a 5-fold increase in the feelings of hopelessness and the suicidal ideation that women in recovery experience with sex and relationships demonstrates an enormous need to more fully address healthy sexuality in the treatment of female addicts in recovery. So why am I doing this course? Well, one of